Thank you, Jonathan. Dr. Jonathan Fine was a senior researcher at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at ICT, as well as a faculty member of the Lauder School of Government. He was a dear colleague and friend of me personally and many others at ICT. Jonathan passed away around 2 weeks ago, and I have to say that we are all still shocked from this tragedy. It was during a speaking tour that Jonathan was given in the Far East, which started at China, moved on to Japan, and ended with his tragic death in Australia. There are many people in this hall who knew Jonathan on a personal basis, others who did not, but even those who really knew him were not necessarily aware of how great scholar and a great person he was, and the real pundit. As the grandson of one of the Israeli greatest poets of all times, Alexander Pen, Jonathan inherited a love of art and literature. And in this framework, he wrote 3 literary publications. Mario Ran Far in 2001, the greatest of them is Love, 2003, and On 3 Bridges, 2005. Jonathan was a spiritual person and a man of values, and as such, he was ordained as a conservative rabbi. Jonathan was a leading scholar specializing in religion, fundamentalism, and political violence, with special emphasis on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He also had a deep interest in the Middle Eastern affairs, with special emphasis on Europe, United States policies, and so on and so forth. In this framework, Jonathan published 2 books, The Birth of a State, The Establishment of the Israeli Governmental System. This was published in 2009. And recently, Political Violence and Judaism, Christianity and Islam, from Holy War to Modern Terrorism, and this is becoming really one of the leading books in this field. As I mentioned, Jonathan was a faculty member at the Lauder School of Government and an academic advisor to our students. As such, Jonathan was one of the most beloved and popular teachers among the students. Jonathan educated generations of students and instilled in them the knowledge and the love of learning, as well as respect and the love of men. Jonathan's family is with us here today. His wife, Ruti, and his son, David. Danny, sorry, his son, Danny. All of us, his family, his friends, as I said, are really still shocked by his sudden death. Jonathan was supposed to speak in this conference, and even though he didn't get to do so, he's still with us today in spirit. May the memory of Jonathan Fine be blessed. Thank you.
Jonathan is certainly missed, and had he been with us today, he'd be schmoozing with each and every one of us the way he always schmoozed, and he's missing here. And as head of the international school, where about 30% of the students at IDC Herzliya are international students, Jonathan left a tremendous mark on the international students, and many students from overseas actually came to study diplomacy at IDC Herzliya as a result of Jonathan's presence. He had made a very, very strong mark. Now, we're moving on to a different subject here. We're now going to be calling on Mr. Steve Lind to come up here and to begin the moderation of the name of the game, Countering Violent Extremism. Steve Lind is the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. And so I'm inviting Mr. Lind to please come up here. Oh, there you are. Okay, there you are. You never want to mess around with the Jerusalem Post. By the way, there was 2 good articles in the Jerusalem Post today about the ICT conference, so he's doing a good job.
Thank you.
You can call on your colleagues to join.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Yeah, it's my honor to invite to the stage Mr. William Braniff, the Executive Director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, START, at the University of Maryland in the US. Professor Boaz Ganor, who you all know, founder and executive director of ICT, the Ronald Lauder Chair for Counterterrorism and Dean of the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy here at IDC Herzliya. Professor Rohan Gunaratna, excuse me if I mispronounced your name, Director of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Welcome. Dr. Matthew Levitt, former Wexler Fellow and Director, Stein Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, Washington Institute for Near East Policy in the US. Professor Peter Neumann, the Director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College in London. Is it Newman? Newman, yeah. And Dr. David Pollock, the Kaufman Fellow at the Washington Institute, also in the US. Dr. Errol Southers, the Director of the Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies at Safe Communities Institute, SCI, and Adjunct Professor at the SOL Price School, Sol Price School of Public Policy, University of Southern California, USC, in the US, in Los Angeles. Welcome to you all. I know you haven't really come to hear me speak, but we'll after a short introduction, give each panelist a chance to address you, and then we'll open it up to discussion. But let me say that if you haven't read Boaz Ganor's fantastic new book, Global Alert, I highly recommend you do. I reviewed it for the Jerusalem Post this coming Friday for 9/11, and there's a really good definition of the subject we're speaking about, terrorism and extremism, violence, and in it, Professor Ganor proposes this working definition of terrorism. It's a type of political violence in which a non-state actor makes deliberate use of violence against civilians to achieve political, that is, national, socioeconomic, ideological, or religious ends. The intrinsic nature of modern terrorism as a violent political act is what makes it far more dangerous than simple criminal activity. Terrorists motivated by political goals pose a greater threat to the social order and solidarity of the target state than do criminal offenders. And he goes on, and of course I'll let Professor Ganor do it in his own words, but I think it's a good start. As editor of the Jerusalem Post, we have no problem using the word terrorism. I know other news agencies and newspapers around the world, even when they're referring to terrorist groups such as Daesh, ISIS, call them militant groups or extremist violent groups. And yet, recently, when we had the situation of an attack on the Palestinian village of Douma on July the 31st, we started using the word Jewish terrorism again, and our readership had a big problem with that. How they said, can you call it Jewish terrorism when you have no proof? And as you probably know, there is a gag order over the whole case. But just as we call Islamic terrorism, so we felt it was only fair to call this Jewish terror until proven otherwise. Of course, I don't have proof yet. But this is certainly a topic for discussion. I'd like to pay, just lastly, a final, my own personal salute to Dr. Jonathan Fine, whom I met and who was a wonderful man. I remember him discussing being the grandson of Alexander Penn and attending one of his lectures on the role of religion and terror, and I believe he spoke in Australia, and you can see it on YouTube. There's a video of him talking his last speech about the role of religion, which I'm particularly interested in terrorism. He was a wonderful man and will be sorely missed by us all. I'd like to also pay tribute to a colleague of mine at the Jerusalem Post who exactly a year ago was executed by ISIS. His name was Steven Sotloff. We kept it a big secret that he wrote for the Jerusalem Post, and more specifically for the Jerusalem Report, at his family's request, both that he was Israeli, that he was Jewish, that he wrote for us. And we really, I think successfully kept it from the world in order to try and save his life. But as you know, I think it was on September the 3rd last year, he was executed in a very dramatic scene, which we saw all over the media and television, YouTube, social media. And it was one of my dilemmas as editor, and I'm still not sure that I made the right decision, whether to run that picture of the executioner, that British executioner, over Steven Sotloff just before he was executed. And I'm not sure I was right, but my journalistic instinct took over from my personal ethical instinct, and we ran the picture. Again, it was very painful, and his family was not happy with the decision. But sometimes pictures are so much more powerful than words. Not that words are not powerful. And this discussion is all about words, about our definition of terrorism and extremism, and what does that mean in practice. So with those thoughts, I'd like to open it up by first inviting Mr. William Braniff to, unless Boaz, do you want to start by outlining? No, it's fine? Okay, to address us. Thank you very much.
Find the clicker here. So my name is William Braniff. I'm in a stuffy suit. I'm wearing a red, white, and blue tie, and I have a PowerPoint deck. So I give you one guess what country I'm from. I'm here representing the START Consortium, which is a multidisciplinary research center, a DHS center of excellence, but based at the University of Maryland. And we look at terrorism and counterterrorism through the lens of behavioral and social sciences. And prior to working at START, I had the distinct honor of working at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point with my friend and colleague, Professor Asaf Moghadam. And I want to thank both Asaf and Boaz for the invitation to be with you all here today. The premise of my talk is that of the various problems associated with the term CVE, they primarily stem from its lack of specificity. That violent extremism has been countered is just a hopeful end state. To counter something doesn't tell us anything about how we intend to counter it. And in a politicized arena, leaving things open to interpretation is problematic. If we need an umbrella term, I would recommend framing these efforts as the marginalization of violent extremism. In the United States, we do not expect African Americans to marginalize or fight against the KKK. Only the Protestant white community can do such. With respect to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL, only Sunnis can marginalize Sunni extremism. And whatever efforts we do, we should frame them in the lens of building the capacity of Sunni partners to marginalize those extremist groups. We can talk more about that during Q&A if it's interesting, but to the topic at hand. So CVE has several conceptual problems from the United States perspective. First, we use the same term to describe entirely different activities conducted by entirely different actors over entirely different timelines with entirely different degrees of volition for both domestic and international efforts. Right? In the United States, we obviously have much more control over how we engage with these behaviors as opposed to working in a foreign country. But yet we use the same term, and I think that leads to tremendous confusion in terms of policy. The term itself is not favored by those practitioners who actually do CVE work domestically for various reasons. It stereotypes the very community that you're trying to empower and work with. The people who actually engage in this kind of behavior on the ground prefer to use the term building community resilience or empowering communities. Others, on the other end of the spectrum, feel that the term is just too politically correct and lacks any specificity. We're not calling a spade with respect to Muslim extremism. Now, what's interesting is that these problems over fuzzy definitions are nearly identical to the endless debates over the definition of terrorism and the definition of counterterrorism. And because of these fuzzy definitions, we have a lot of overlap between these two topics, CVE and CT. So what I'd like to do is just walk you through a way to think about these issues, and specifically the overlap between CVE and CT, by borrowing shamelessly from a co-panelist, Peter, who presented almost this identical slide many years ago, in which I'm stealing wholeheartedly, at an event hosted by Matt Levitt, another member of the panel. The idea here is, if we take the simplest approach to radicalization, we break it down into its component parts, right? There are articulated grievances. This creates either the cognitive or emotional opening for an individual who's answer-seeking. Along comes a militant ideology, explains what's wrong with the world and what that person needs to do to fix it. That's socialized and mobilized to create a violent extremist or a violent extremist group. If we understand that very simple premise for radicalization, then clearly what we have to do is try to address grievances, fill cognitive openings with a positive alternative, counter militant ideologies, and disrupt mobilization, failing all else. Well, what I'd like to do is expand this general concept outside of just the scope of radicalization to the rest of the spectrum of violent extremism. Here you see the same components of radicalization mapped to the same components of counter-radicalization. Grievance, cognitive emotion, ideology, mobilization. But I've also included organizational level characteristics of violent extremist groups, like the establishment of safe haven and the process of organizing for a campaign of violence. And I've similarly mapped the responses to these characteristics. What becomes obvious is that what we often call CVE, the first four elements, overlaps very significantly with aspects of both counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. Well, this undermines CVE efforts, as they are seen as a ruse to gain intelligence for the purposes of counterterrorism, as opposed to programs designed to empower communities to self-police and to marginalize extremists within their ranks. So for this reason, I would suggest describing CVE efforts specifically by its component parts instead of using a problematic umbrella term. So pragmatically, domestically, we should call it what it is, programmatically. Engagement programming, prevention programming, intervention programming, rehabilitation programming, et cetera, all through the lens of marginalizing extremist groups within broader communities. Similarly, abroad, we already do all of these things. When we're thinking about violent extremist groups, we should be thinking about how to gear these efforts towards marginalization of violent extremist groups. So for example, capacity building. When the Department of Defense does capacity building abroad, capacity building for what? We should be building the capacity of these communities to marginalize Sunni extremist groups within their ranks. And that's not the way we tend to think about capacity building efforts, right? And I think it's because we haven't necessarily framed this in a realistic manner. More broadly, in the United States, I don't think we trust our domestic constituency with the specifics. And what we've done is we've tried to paper over a very complex issue with a very generic umbrella term that actually lacks meaning. And when you do that, you give your critics, the people on the ends of the political spectrum, the opportunity to define these programs for themselves. They get to use their own terms, and they get to tell you, the government, what they think that your program is about. And I think it's time that we trust the domestic constituency of the United States with the specifics of what we're doing. And by calling these programs by their actual programmatic names and their intentions, I think we can hopefully get past the endless debate about how we define the umbrella terms counterterrorism and CVE. Thank you. I never flipped. Thank you. I'm okay, thank you.
My punishment for driving 3 hours from Jerusalem in terrible traffic today is that I get to do some physical exercise to introduce each panelist. But it really is my honor to introduce again Professor Boaz Ganor, who is so good at giving an overall picture of the situation, better than anyone else I know.
Thank you, Steve. What I want to do in the short time that I have today with you is starting by referring to the new wave of Muslim immigration to Europe. I want to tie that to the question of if and how this might influence future waves of terrorism in Europe, and what is needed to be done in order to thwart that, and how all of this is connected to the question of what is CVE and what is counterterrorism altogether. So all of that in 10 minutes, chicken feed. I would like to argue that Europe is now facing a real huge dilemma, the moral dilemma, which putting this paradox between the fear of large waves of immigration into Europe and looking at those thousands or tens of thousands that are, as we speak, doing their way to Central Europe as only the spearhead of a much bigger wave that might come after them. And down the road, those which are worried from that threat, down the road, they believe that this might actually change the Christian traditional nature of the continent of Europe. But on the other hand, there are the Christian European values which are on stake. Multiculturalism, liberalism, the question of opening the gates for people in need. This is a real moral dilemma. And the moral dilemma probably is and will be influenced by the question, who are those which are now knocking on the door, on the gates of Europe, and what are the intentions while doing that? Well, one answer to that could be that we are talking about mainly political refugees who really need asylum, and work seekers who want to improve their socio-economical situation. That's probably what the situation is. Others would argue that among this crowd, you might find Islamists who will try to Islamize Europe down the road. And even if those people are right, then the question is, how do you differ between the two altogether? Well, I think that there would not be a dispute that this European dilemma, this huge European dilemma, is based on few sub-dilemmas or sub-questions. One of them has to do with demography, the multicultural diversity on one hand, and on the other hand, the possibility of the change of the Christian nature of Europe. The economic question, will this wave and the next wave of Muslim immigration to Europe will be a huge burden on the European economy, or at least for the long run, it will boost European economy. And we saw many cases in which large immigration actually, for the long run, did very well to the economy of that country. That has to do with the social aspect. Would those new immigrants, Muslim immigrants to Europe, create new islands of cultural isolationism, or they will be synergetically integrated into the society? But I'm interested in the last question. And the last question is, will this new immigration wave will bring pragmatic coexistence or more violent extremism? And when we are analyzing that dilemma, we need to differ between three possible impacts that has to do with security and terrorism in reference to this huge wave of Muslim immigration to Europe. The immediate threat is the possible infiltration of returning foreign fighters and other terrorists which will camouflage themselves among the from Syria and Iraq, and among the refugees, they would step into Europe and through the Schengen Agreement, of course, spread out all over Europe. I have to say that just yesterday, I read a piece of information that ISIS spokesman is arguing that already they infiltrated 4,000 foreign fighters into Europe in this recent wave of immigration. If you ask my professional guts feeling on that, this is an exaggeration and probably lip service, but the intention is there, and I don't think we are talking about thousands, but dozens definitely should be taken under considerations. In the midterm threat, the radicalization process might give birth in the midterm to violent extremism in the it's not new, but current type of terrorist attacks, which is the lone wolf type of attack. But I'm again interested in the third dimension, in the long-term dimension, which I would argue the frustration that those new immigrants, and especially the second and the third generation of immigrants of this wave and the coming waves, will give birth, will lead to violent extremism and terrorism. And for that, I would like to share with you rapidly an article which I wrote a few years ago under the title Intifada in Europe, Intifada Popular Uprising. And I did there something which is almost inconceivable. I mixed oranges with apples, or if you wish, vegetables with fruits. I compared social processes that have happened within the Palestinian people after '67 occupation. I compared that to processes that Muslim immigrants have faced, and this is before this wave of immigration, have experienced in Europe. And actually, I compared those processes between the two generations, the first generation and the second generation. So briefly, when we talk about the first generation of the Palestinians, one who witnessed the Israeli occupation in '67, we see something very interesting. The situation in the West Bank and Gaza was very difficult from social economical point of view before the occupation. A high rate of unemployment, people was in economic, and the first thing that happened after Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, the gates to Israel have been opened for the labor, the Palestinian labor, which you can imagine was a blue ribbon type of hard work, not very high salary. But employment went to zero, and the salaries was much higher than they used to earn before that. So practically, those people for a few years after the occupation was quite happy with this new situation that they have. They compared their situation to what happened with their family and friends that stayed in refugee camps in Egypt, in Jordan, Lebanon, and other places, and they was quite happy with the situation. They invested a lot in the education of the second generation of the Palestinians. The second generation Palestinians are one of the most hated Arab nation in the Arab world altogether. When we look at the first generation of the Muslim immigrants to Europe, in general, there were asylum seekers and those who wanted to improve their economic situation. When they came there, they immediately engaged in hard work, not very well paid, the work that the local didn't want to do because it was unpaid, because it was very difficult, but they were very happy with the situation. Why? Because the biggest dream that they ever had was that they will be granted the citizenship of a Western country, a European Western country, and just by being granted that and being able to work and earn the money, they were quite happy with the situation. They always could look backwards, talk to the friends and family that stayed in the home country, and see how fortunate they have by being part of that country. The education of the second generation, again, was much higher, not necessarily because they invested in that, because the local authorities, governments in Europe invested in that, and the second generation is usually much more educated. Going back to the second generation of the Palestinians, Hebrew, because they were engaged with the Israeli society, but they were not even second-class citizens. There were no-class citizens of Israel because there was not citizens of Israel. They were in Tel Aviv, they were in, all over, but not part of the society. They had an identity crisis. They were unintegrated, and they had a different system from the Israelis altogether, much more educated, as I said before, which created, by the way, a generation crisis between the father figure and the second generation of the Palestinians. Why? Because they were so angry on the parents that they don't see the miserable situation that they live in and are happy with this situation. They were not, and they were frustrated as an outcome of that. The same thing happened with the second generation. I'm talking, of course, in general, the second generation of Muslim immigrants to Europe. Born as local citizens, nobody gave them any favor by being French or whoever, literate in the local language. Identity crisis, who am I? A Moroccan living in Spain, an Algerian living in France, or am I really a French person? Different value system, educated, which created generation crisis, the figure with the parents altogether. In both cases, I would argue it led to the same solution, radical Islam. Why? Because there were radical Islamic movements who took advantage on this frustration and this conflict, social conflict that they had among the society, friends, and family. They offered them an alternative value and law order system, new identity. You are not a French, you are not a Moroccan, you are not an Algerian, you are part of the Ummah, the greater nation of Islam, and this is, of course, very valuable. And the goal of the Islamic Caliphate state, if it's Europe, it's in Europe, if it's in Palestine, it's in Palestine, and the way to achieve that is by violent jihad altogether. This, in my view, if things will not change in the coming years, will be also the outcome of the new wave of immigration of Muslim immigrants to Europe. How can this be stopped, if at all? First of all, there is the responsibility of the hosting state. And I would say that the hosting state needs to have a strategy which will combine stick and carrots. Carrots, integration, equality, improving their welfare, care of the future, allow cultural diversity but prevent cultural enclaves, and also developing integrated education. Don't let them have their secluded education, Arabic speaking. It has nothing to do with the value, with the system of this state. Sticks, granting citizenship only after accepting officially those immigrants, accepting the liberal democratic nature and values of the country, the constitution, and having at least minimal lingual capability because they need to integrate. And if they are not integrated, this is a threat. Outlawing incitement, outlawing the call for violence and extremism. But there is also the responsibility of the Muslim community itself, no less than the responsibility of the governments in Europe. And I'm talking about acknowledging their responsibility for CVE. As said before, Bill, they have the responsibility. They are the only one who can counter violent extremism. They can identify that better than anybody else. And that's first and foremost their responsibility to counter that and prevent violence and terrorism altogether. Accepting the state values and promoting the integration. That's the responsibility of the community as well. Identifying the early stage of radicalization and cooperating with the state agencies to prevent that. Not as a favor that they are doing to the state, in order to actually promote their community and integrate them in the society, and pointing out and expelling bad seeds from their own community. There are few preconditions to that. First and foremost, we, scholars, need to identify, need to analyze the We need to understand how and when a person turns into radicalism, and we need to find a way to have this joint work between the state agencies and the Muslim communities. How all of that has to do with the terminology that Bill referred to. And I go back to what I believe is the embryonic understanding of what is terrorism is all about. I call it the formula of terrorism. Terrorism is a combination of two factors: motivation and operational capability. Actually, motivation, multiple operational capability. Because if one of the factors is missing, either motivation or operational capability, the whole equation is zero at the end of the day. From the equation of terrorism, we can learn what is the equation of effective counterterrorism. The same equation: motivation and operational capability. If you want to be effective in your counterterrorism policies, you need to deal with the burst to terrorism, but you need to deal with the operational capability of the terrorist at the same time. I would like to argue that CVE deals only with one half of the equation. CVE, counterterrorism, violent extremism, deals only with the prevention of motivation. I'm not underestimating that. But dealing with one factor, it's not good enough. It's a temporary solution, and it's very difficult to deal with. There is another factor, which is COC, which is countering operational capability. I'm talking about practical operations in order to prevent the funds, the arms, the manpower, the know-how of the terrorists. Only the two would give, at the end of the day, counterterrorism, effective counterterrorism policy. One word, I would argue that this is not a mistake, that we see more and more discussion on CVE instead of terrorism. It's not that really most of the people who are talking about CVE they see this as a replacement to the discussion on counterterrorism, which is deadly wrong, and I refer deadly wrong. Practically, what is needed is to understand that CVE is part of counterterrorism and term as a political correctness term in order to try to appease those that might be hurt from the fact that you refer to those people who behead innocent civilians as terrorists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ganor. And now for a completely different perspective, I think it's my honor to call on Professor Rohan Gunaratna from Singapore. Thank you.
Professor Boaz Gano, ladies and gentlemen. I used to come to Israel quite often to teach at ICT, and on one occasion, Dr. Boaz Gano introduced Jonathan Fine, and I taught his class. I think I probably taught twice or thrice at his class on religion. He was a giant in many ways. He knew a lot beyond Israel. So I pay my respects and my tribute to you. The young man, you should not think your father has died. He's very much in you. If we divide the threat of terrorism into three branches, I will say that there is anti-terrorism, which is protection of humans and infrastructure. Second is operational counterterrorism, that is if you cannot kill a terrorist, you should catch him. If you cannot disrupt a terrorist, then you should look at other options. But operational counterterrorism is in many ways the domain of the expertise of the Israelis. They have mastered it. Perhaps the greatest weakness of Israeli counterterrorism strategy is CVE, which is strategic counterterrorism. The Americans have coined the phrase countering violent extremism. Countering violent extremism is to change the environment, that is to create an environment that is very hostile to the terrorist, unfriendly to terrorist supporters. So how do we do this, and why do we need to do this? In the last 1 year, the global threat of terrorism has proliferated very significantly. The Al-Qaeda, the spear of the global jihad movement, has been supplanted by ISIS, the Islamic State. About 32 groups that pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda, they are now changing their support to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leader of IS. IS has become the most dominant player in the international terrorism arena. The second most significant development is that ISIS has demonstrated its mastery in the use of social media. 90,000 tweets every day, extensive use of Facebook, blog, and Instagram. No terrorist group in history or recent history has mastered the use of the cyberspace to the extent of IS. Although the social media emerged in late 2004, 2005, we have seen that IS really knows how to manipulate and extensively exploit this medium. If you look at the IS quality of movies they produce, they are Hollywood action-packed thriller types compared to the long, boring rantings and speeches of Al-Qaeda and Ayman al-Zawahiri. So in many ways, IS is a young generation terrorist appealing to our youth, and that's why they are always recruiting from a younger age range. Threat is very significant. Governments are crawling, IS is sprinting. And I think that unless we now move forward to prevent the spread of extremism, terrorism will be more frequent. Terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, is a vicious byproduct of ideological extremism, of intolerance, of our inability to work with other communities, build bridges with other religious and ethnic groups. So let me share with you a little bit of our experience in Asia, how we have managed the threat of terrorism, especially in Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia. We have introduced two very important prongs in the fight against terrorism under CVE. One is terrorist rehabilitation. So all terrorists who are in custody, they are offered rehabilitation. Of course, many terrorists do not want to be rehabilitated because they cling to their extremist beliefs. So not every terrorist can be rehabilitated. Terrorists who repent, who express remorse, who cooperate with the authorities, and certainly they are very ripe for rehabilitation. This is the work that is done in custodial settings, and also once they are reintegrated, there is continuous monitoring of them. But the same modes of rehabilitation are applied to continuously engage them. So what are these modes of rehabilitation? The most effective mode of rehabilitation against Muslim terrorism is religious and spiritual rehabilitation, because the terrorists and the extremists, they have their own version of Islam, which is Salafism, Wahhabism, the violent forms. So what we are doing is we are using moderate and mainstream clerics to engage those who are in custody and try to replace their negative ideologies with positive ones to promote harmony and peace. We have met with some success, and many of those who have undergone rehabilitation, they have cooperated. Second is educational rehabilitation. Terrorists are very poorly educated, except perhaps the leadership and some of the experts. So we use teachers are best at mentoring youth, and we use teachers to rehabilitate terrorists. We have had some amazing successes. Third is vocational rehabilitation. We teach them agriculture, farming, fishery, computer, so that they prepare for their next life. Terrorists deserve very long sentences, but once they come out, or in cases where there isn't enough evidence and they would be released early, they are taught those skills, often in collaboration with the private sector, because the private sector, the businesses, they have very good capabilities to teach their own workers. Fourth form of rehabilitation is social and family rehabilitation. When you become a terrorist, you abandon your family. So we reconnect them back to their mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, grandmothers, and their children. Sometimes we see tears in their eyes as the grandmothers narrate to them their own history of their past, where they wished that the son or the grandson would become a doctor, but instead became a killer. So reconnecting them to the family has become very important. Another mode of rehabilitation that we have seeded is sports and recreational rehabilitation, where they play not against the guards, but with the guards. And often it's one of the methods of judging how a detainee or an inmate has progressed in rehabilitation, whether his aggression has diminished towards the guards, towards the counselors, towards the case officers who visit them. Another mode of rehabilitation is creative arts in rehabilitation, the use of song, dance, music, puppetry, and other form of arts to engage those detainees. I often say that if you are true to your culture, very difficult for you to become a terrorist, because the form of terrorism that is being advocated by ISIS is culturally very sterile. They destroy monuments. And one of the key places where we take our terrorists is to the museums, the art galleries, so that they will understand that Islam also had its own variations. Another mode of rehabilitation is psychological rehabilitation. In the case of ISIS, we have seen that they are mostly misfits, especially in the European context. Those who have done poorly at school, failed at work, and is unable to manage their family lives. And what we do is, through psychological rehabilitation, the counselor and the psychologist is able to identify what went wrong and try to treat that detainee. Terrorist rehabilitation doesn't end when a terrorist is released from custody. The rehabilitation continues in the community reintegration phase. In fact, the success of custodial rehabilitation is in rehabilitation. So rehabilitation is one of the two prongs in the fight against terrorism, against extremism. Another one is community engagement. We have also worked with the Muslim community leaders and empowered them and given them the tools, the capabilities, the staff to engage the Muslim communities. Muslim communities are threatened worldwide. Many youth do not know what Islam to follow, because ISIS presents itself as puritanical Muslims compared to traditional and cultural Islam. So the community leaders promote the traditional and cultural Islam, where the Muslims lived in harmony with other communities and other religious groups. So how do they do that? They engage the Muslim youth. They engage those who are most vulnerable, and build bridges of friendship, and try to influence them. Expose ISIS as ruthless and as brutal, and as a politically motivated group, and a group that is performing acts of violence that is not permitted in Islam. So I want to share with you that CVE is not a perfect art. It is not as powerful, not as kinetic as the operational counterterrorism measures, where there are quick results. But certainly, in the long term, CVE may be more effective. If you look at the failures of Iraq, where the finest armies of the world failed, it is very important to think that we need to apply a full spectrum, a complete range of tools in the fight against terrorism and extremism. Firstly, to prevent someone from becoming a terrorist, and once that person becomes a terrorist, then to apply kinetic tools. But certainly, in conclusion, I would like to say that if you do not rehabilitate a terrorist, three things will happen when that person is released, sooner or later. One is that person will go and infect others with his or her ideas. Second, he will pose a security because we'll want to do attacks, because that person will believe that it is his religious duty to do so. And finally, if you do not rehabilitate a terrorist and get that terrorist publicly to recant and express remorse, condemn the terrorist organization, certainly what will happen is that that terrorist will be hailed as an icon of the terrorist group. So in many ways, the fight against terrorism today, because of the severity of the threat, it is paramount beyond government to work with community partners and other organizations the threat of terrorism. I thank you very much.
All right, so it's my pleasure then to introduce Dr. David Levitt from the Washington Institute for Near East Studies. Sorry, Matthew Levitt, sorry. David Levitt's another Levitt.
Good morning. It's been a long time since I've been confused with my colleague David Pollack, but he's a wonderful, wonderful guy. I've been confused with much worse. It is a real pleasure to be back here at the ICT conference. It's 15th conference, and there's really nothing else like it in the world. They take tremendous pleasure and pride in sitting on your board and give you and your staff tremendous credit for putting this together. For those of us who are here, it all seems to run so smoothly, but for anybody who's actually put on a conference, hopefully you can appreciate a little bit of how much effort must go into this and what a fantastic job you've done. And it therefore is all the more appropriate a place and a real honor to be in a panel that is Professor Fine, who was a remarkable man and a remarkable scholar, and whose memory and work and contributions will live on, not only through his own work and contributions, but those of his colleagues and the institutions with which he was affiliated. And I take tremendous pride in playing just even on this panel. When you talk about a topic like CVE on a panel like this with people who work this and have been doing it for a very long time, including have been on panels together before, as you heard, you really have to think of something new to say each time. And so what I thought is I'd talk about kind of two themes here. One is the idea that we should appreciate that the fundamental principle that there is an imperative, a need to counter violent extremism. I don't really like the term. I liked it better when we used to talk about countering radicalization. I'll tell you why in a minute. The fact that it is widely accepted today, we shouldn't take that for granted. But the problem is that the term CVE means different things to different people. And while for a long time this was not a high priority in the West, especially in the United States, where we still have problems with this term and implementing these ideas, focus today on it should not be taken for granted. But the pendulum has swung, I would argue, so strong in the opposite direction now. It's at a point where CVE, as a term of trade, refers to a tremendously broad spectrum of policies, activities, areas of study. Unfortunately, CVE today is all things to all people. But CVE means nothing, or at least very little, if it includes everything. So what is it exactly? First, I think it's important to appreciate that it's a good thing that CVE is back on the agenda. I remember back in 2008 at the Washington Institute, we did a big bipartisan study with advisors to what was then the Obama and the McCain presidential campaigns, and we did research in the United States and across Europe. This was fairly new back then, and getting people's attention was really only possible because it was in the United States anyway, because it was a presidential campaign. In the years that followed in the United States, there was really no interest in this because it was uncomfortable. Because ultimately, if you are going to counter an ideology which bases itself, describes itself in religious terms, for the United States, separation of etc., this is extraordinarily uncomfortable. What role should the government be playing in a debate about religious ideology, or at least ideology that describes itself in religious terms? For several years, there was one person at the White House who had this on his had 6 things on his agenda, and the way he described it to me, I have 6 things on my agenda, and this is the 7th. But he was the person for whom this was the placeholder. But if you wanted to get the government to think about this, to hold conferences about this, to have conversations about this, it was all but impossible. Certainly inconsistent attention and funding, and when we have paid attention, it's always been in response to events. So suddenly we saw that there were Somali American youth being drawn from Minneapolis to Mogadishu in the Shabab context, which was something apart and also something slightly different. Al-Qaeda. Then Inspire magazine from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula came and brought together a combination of motivation, that is radicalization, and mobilization, that is to say a kind of how-to knowledge, a do-it-yourself kind of publication that created this kind of do-it, inspired you to do it, and then provided you with instructions on how to do it. Literally, how to make a bomb in the kitchen of your mom. And then the sharp rise, not in online activity alone, but in social media activity. And the difficulties we have because of the way First Amendment rights are interpreted in particular, with cracking down on some of this activity on Twitter, on Facebook, etc. Today, the only reason this is getting the kind of attention it's getting today is because of the sharp rise in the foreign terrorist fighter threat. Not because of Syria, not because of Iraq. It wasn't until those threats had a peace in foreign terrorist fighters returning that suddenly CVE became something at the forefront again. Because we had a situation where now not Inspire, but Dabiq, the Islamic States magazine, was calling for people to don't even have to come here to Syria and Iraq, just do what you're going to do at home. The entire concept of lone offender terrorism, where suddenly belonging formally in a group isn't as important, it's the idea, it's the ideology, has changed things for us. And in the context of today's threat, in particular terrorist fighter threat, there are lower and lowered barriers to entry. The geoproximity of Syria, the very low cost of travel to Syria, in both cases, for example, as compared to, say, Afghanistan, and the networks, in person and even more so, both, that are facilitating all of this. Aside from the foreign terrorist fighter issue, which brought CVE to the forefront, there were other issues. The returning foreign terrorist fighter issue has raised what I would call parallel issues. And I would put the extremely important programs that Rohan just described in this parallel basket. I think it's a very big mistake to describe rehabilitation, which is critical and has had great success, or de-radicalization in the same basket with counter-radicalization or countering violent extremism. If for no other reason, you will frequently find governments and international institutions, you ask them, what are you doing about CVE? And they will tell you the rehabilitation and the de-radicalization programs that they're putting in place. But that is not preventing radicalization. That is trying to figure out what to do about those people who have already become radicalized and are a law enforcement and intelligence issue. This is critical to deal with them, and these programs are important. If for no other reason, as Rohan implied, in many cases, we do not have enough usable law enforcement evidence, sometimes not even intelligence, to be able to put these people in jail. And you want to be able to do something with them. I've hosted events, including with Rohan, on rehabilitation. This is critically important. I would argue it is a subset. It is not core countering violent extremism. There are a great many things that can contribute to radicalization, and we need policies to address each of these in turn. But not all of these should fall under the rubric of CVE as such. CVE, I would argue, in its purest form, is the grassroots intervention in communities, here and now, to prevent people in our communities, mostly youth, from being drawn to and radicalized by extremist ideologies. I think, therefore, is misleading. If the people we're dealing with, if the ideas we're dealing with are already violent extremists, we're a day late and a dollar short. This is all about, to me, moving the needle earlier in the process, identifying at-risk communities, at-risk, and putting in place policies and programs to prevent their radicalization. This means not just contesting radical ideologies and exposing them for the false panaceas they are, but even more importantly, addressing the social, familial, cultural, psychological issues that create this cognitive opening that some of my colleagues have already mentioned that make people interested in these radical, dangerous, and violent ideas in the first place. There is increasing consensus among Western governments that the foreign terrorist fighters flocking to ISIS from Western countries are drawn at least as much by a yearning for a sense of belonging, camaraderie, empowerment, a sense of purpose, identity, as they are to the group's radical Islamist ideology, which usually fills the gaps created by those problems. That means we need to counter the ideology, sure, but even more, or at least as importantly, we need to address those social, psychological, cognitive issues. Let's be blunt, that's not sexy stuff. And so it suffers from a lack of coordination, a lack of interest, and most critically, a severe lack of funding. CVE efforts should be focused on moving the needle early in the process before law enforcement would get involved, certainly in the states, which means the agencies driving such efforts cannot be law enforcement agencies alone. Longer-term efforts from foreign aid to literacy programs all have their place and can contribute to long-term strategic CVE planning, and they should be recognized as something important from addressing the immediate social psychological issues, especially given the fact that today we suffer from an extremely slippery slope, an extraordinarily fast pace of radicalization compared to what we've seen in the past. Much younger people being radicalized much more quickly. And as Paul has pointed out, in the context of the migrant crisis we're facing today, these are critical issues because it's one thing out of a humanitarian interest to allow migrants in. It's another to do so if you don't have social integration, social cohesion programs to help them adjust. Think about stories about people who survived a capsizing boat being grateful for being allowed into Europe, but feeling not so comfortable in their new countries. Last February, the White House held this Countering Violent Extremism Summit. There are quite a few of us here in the room who were there. Later this month, President Obama will be hosting a leaders' summit on countering ISIL and violent extremism on the margins of the UN General Assembly. I've got 3 points that I would and will raise for those people. First is for CVE efforts at home in the United States. I think we have 3 major concerns. This is what I'd highlight for them. The first is that effective CVE efforts require both community and a response to the ideological underpinnings of radicalization. We in the United States have made great strides in the former, and we are nowhere near where we need to be in the latter. The good news is that we do have now 3 pilot programs across the United States in Los Angeles, and Minneapolis, and Boston. It's good that these are all very different types of these phenomena do not manifest themselves in exactly the same way in every community, but we have a very long way to go, in part in finding ways to feel comfortable, as you heard in this morning's session, Brian's presentation about figuring out ways, what the ideas should be, how they should be communicated, and finding a way to do so that we're not uncomfortable countering a violent extremist ideology that professes itself to be religious. The second, I would argue, is that in the US in particular, we have structural and programmatic deficits when it comes to preventing and countering violent extremism. We don't have, for example, a Department of Community and Local Governments, or even really a Home Office, as in the UK. Federal government working with state and local government has improved, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. There's debate now, a bill in Congress about creating an assistant secretary for CVE position within the Department of Homeland Security. I don't know that that is going to be the fix. This is something we need to think very hard and long about. And the third, and perhaps most controversial, but I would argue most important, is this. While I argue that CVE is about doing things now in our communities, I recognize that long-term CVE, strategic CVE, is equally important, and therefore doing things, whether it's through foreign aid or literacy programs or other things, they have their place and they're important. But those are really long-term. In between, there's something else where we are doing things today, our actions, our policies, are severely undermining our efforts. And so while it's important to recognize that local factors play a role in radicalization, there is a major policy component in all of this too. We need to recognize that while some Muslims are drawn to the idea of creating a caliphate in Syria or in Iraq, the barbarism carried out by the Assad regime against Syrian civilians, and the Assad regime has killed many more people than the so-called Islamic State, and the accompanying lack of a response from Western governments has been one of the main factors driving Sunnis to join the fight in Syria. The West has become military involved, first to protect its own citizens and then minorities, but frankly, we haven't done much to get involved to protect Sunnis who are bearing the brunt of this barbarism. And there's a resulting perception, as any of you who spend time in the region know, that the West's policy, and in particular the US policy, has helped create an extremely dangerous situation in which thousands of Sunnis are traveling to Syria and inflaming around the region. I would argue that as long as Assad remains in power, he will be a magnet for foreign fighters who will oppose his rule, and that has not long-term, but immediate ramifications for our CVE efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We're running out of time and still speakers, so let me call on Professor Peter Newman from King's College in London.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me say that I didn't know Jonathan Fine very well, but I'd seen him at several conferences here. I chatted to him briefly, and whenever you encountered Jonathan, it was always clear that he was there because he had an immediate presence and charisma, and he was infecting people with his ideas. So whilst what Rohan said is true, genetically he will live on in his son, he will live on in a lot of other people because he inspired people, even like me, who didn't know him particularly well. I want to slightly contradict what everyone else has said. Thank you. And probably confuse people a little bit more. What I want to do is to explain what I believe CVE is in the context of what I believe radicalization is, what follows from that. And there's, of course, a lot of theories and models about what radicalization entails. I've once counted 30 different theories of radicalization, all different, all about different contexts and locations, yet you can reduce them, actually, if you read across all of them, to 3 common denominators. And it is those 3 common denominators that I briefly want to talk about. In a sense, it's no longer going to be that surprising because Bill actually already put them on the screen. But the important thing is that directly following from these 3 common denominators are 3 important lessons for CVE. So what do we know based on these 30 different models and theories about how people radicalize? What ingredients go into the process? The first is the notion of grievance, the notion of crisis or conflict that is always the basis for people radicalizing. It is the basis for people radicalizing because in order for you to, you have to have a so-called cognitive opening. You have to have an event, a crisis, a conflict that actually opens your minds to a new set of values and ideas. And of course, these crises or conflict can be entirely different in different contexts and to different people. They can be purely personal, they can be political, but there needs to be something that causes you to be upset or that causes you to be aggrieved about your situation and that opens you to the possibility of changing your status quo. And of course, grievances alone are not. Grievances may be necessary, but they are not a sufficient explanation for radicalization. If everyone who was aggrieved became a terrorist, we would have billions of terrorists to deal with. I assume probably a number of people in this room are aggrieved about something or the other, yet I hope, at least, that none of us will become terrorists anytime soon. So grievance is important, it is necessary, but it is not sufficient. There are other ingredients needed. The second one, for lack of a better term, is ideology, or a belief system, or a narrative, whatever you want to call it. You don't have to be stuck with the word ideology. But you need a narrative, an ideology to channel your grievance into a particular kind of action. And I want to illustrate that with one example that I think illustrates it very nicely. It's the example of Terry Nichols, who was the accomplice or the key collaborator of Timothy McVeigh in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. And I read this chapter from this book about Terry Nichols, and I read it with great interest because very, very little has been written about Terry Nichols, but also because it really illustrates the purpose and function of ideology. So it starts off saying Terry Nichols was a failure. He was in his mid-30s. He hadn't hold on to a job. He hadn't been able to hold on to a relationship. He started businesses which all failed, and probably by his mid-30s, he realized himself that he hadn't been an entirely successful human being that far. But then something happens. According to Washington Post, he felt increasingly under the influence of the anti-tax Posse Comitatus, developed ties to Michigan members of the white supremacist Aryan nations. So he falls in, he gets into contact, he finds these far-right extremist groups. And then what happens is really interesting. This is the key sentence. The philosophy of these groups helped him understand they were the government's fault. So that was the important thing that happened to him. Suddenly he realized, I'm not actually a failure. There's a vast conspiracy operating against me. And within months of meeting these groups, he goes from being zero to being a freedom fighter. He has convinced himself that there is a conspiracy operating against him, that he's not a failure, but there's actually a cause that he can fight for. And that's what the ideology does. It grabs your grievance and it channels it into a new political project. It needs an ideology in order for something to be terrorism. Ideology is not necessarily about being an ideologue. We always assume when we hear the word ideology that people who are involved in terrorist groups have read a lot, have spent a lot of time discussing ideological texts. But it's really, I would even argue that the most powerful ideologies are those that can be reduced to fairly simple ideas. And indeed, Samir Khan, who was the editor of Inspire magazine, he said exactly that. He said bin Laden and Zawahiri are geniuses for having the ability to mold their ideology into simple yet influential messages that can reach the grassroots level. So their talent really was in translating something that is really complex into something that is simple and that people on the ground can understand. They're still affected by ideology, even though they are not ideologues. You don't need to be an ideologue in order to be affected by ideology. The important thing about ideology, and that's the last point here, important point about ideology is that it is not ideology on its own or grievances on their own that make someone a terrorist, but the combination of the two. In America and in other countries, there's always a fairly boring political discussion where people left of center like talking about grievances. The people are poor, they're uneducated, we have to help them. People right of center like to talk about the evil ideology. In reality, of course, an ideology cannot be effective if it doesn't speak and resonate with a grievance. A grievance on its own doesn't become terrorism if there is not an ideology that makes sense of it. It is the interplay, the nexus between grievances and ideology that makes a terrorist. It is not one or the other. It is, in fact, both. The third factor that Bill highlighted, and that is really important, is the idea that radicalization is also a social process. Of course, we're talking about lone wolves a lot. In fact, if you look at these lone wolves, quite often, if you study their backgrounds and how they became involved in violent extremism, you will find that quite often they weren't actually radicalizing on their own. Those who were sitting in front of the internet, in front of social media, were actually often socializing with other people. They were physically alone, but they were not lonely. There's a difference between physically alone and being lonely, and that's in fact the important thing about social media, because it allows you to socialize people who are at great distance. So even lone wolves are often not lonely. And the importance of being a social process, and I could give you study after study to demonstrate that, is that it creates commitment and loyalty. A lot of things, think about your family, think about your friends, a lot of things we do in our everyday life we probably wouldn't do if we had the choice not to do it. But we do it because our family expects it, our friends expect it, etc., etc. Quite often, groups exert a lot of pressure on what we do, and it is no different with radical or extremist groups. So these are the three ingredients. Now, these are literally the three ingredients. And what I always end up with in this part of the presentation is to say that radicalization is a soup. We know what goes into the soup, but we still argue about how exactly it is being cooked. And that's what a lot of the academic debates are about. People who believe that ideology is more important than everything else. So they believe ideology is the dominant ingredient of the soup. Other people believe other factors are important. Of course, there are a lot of arguments about how the soup is being cooked. I personally believe there's not one formula that can be discovered, but in fact, and this is where the analogy with the soup kind of breaks down, the soup is being cooked differently in different places. So if you go to, let's say, Afghanistan, obviously the three ingredients assemble in a different way, let's say, from the north of England. That's why I think there's not one formula to be discovered. What are the three lessons for CVE? And here we come to the actual topic. Let me first of all define CVE as I see it. Countering violent extremism is an umbrella term which covers non-coercive, non-kinetic policies and programs designed to prevent radicalization into violent extremism and promote integration of radicalized individuals. And that's why I differ with Boas, because Boas actually sees CVE as part of counterterrorism. I think counterterrorism is about killing and capturing terrorists. It's what in the UK is called pursue. It's the hard stuff. This, CVE, is not counterterrorism. It is something else. It is a non-kinetic, non-coercive, in most cases, stuff that doesn't actually involve the use of legal instruments. That is everything that covers countering violent extremism. And if you look at CVE or counter-radicalization or counter-extremism strategies of countries like Denmark, Australia, Canada, US, Britain, etc., you see always the same key points. What are their objectives? Look at any policy that you've seen in a Western country. There are always three objectives. CVE is about addressing grievances or perception thereof. It's about counter-messaging and countering the ideology. And it is about empowering and creating healthy communities so that terrorist groups cannot mobilize and cannot form these bunches of guys that are important for radicalization. So you can see that it is kind of about reverse engineering the three core ingredients that lead people to becoming radicalized. And around these three activities, they're typically the following kind of programs. And this is where I differ with math, because I do include de-radicalization and disengagement as part of CVE. There's disengagement, which is about getting people to stop engaging in violence. There's de-radicalization, which is about abandoning extremist beliefs. And then there's the big area that Matt described, which is about counter. And the first two differ from the third in the target group. The first two are about targeting people who already hold radical or extremist ideas, and is to try to convince them to either stop engaging in violence or moderate their beliefs. The third is about not targeting radical populations. It is about targeting communities that, for one reason or another, are perceived to be vulnerable to being targeted by extremists at some point in the future. So counter-radicalization is essentially about prevention. But my main point is that all of this taken together, radicalization, counter-radicalization, all of that constitutes CVE. And what I believe is very important is to remember that CVE, and this is my last word, I promise, what's very, very important is about remembering that CVE, all these activities that I've talked about, are not about being nice to terrorists. That's how it's sometimes being communicated. That's how it's sometimes being perceived. We're being nice to terrorists. If you go to European countries, if you speak to European intelligence services or police services, they are at 50 they've been working overtime for 3 years. A lot of the smaller countries, I won't name any particular ones, that have been particularly strongly affected, for example, by the foreign fighter phenomenon, simply do not have the capacity to deal with the numbers that they're currently confronted with. Crying out for things like de-radicalization and disengagement to take care at least of the softer cases so they don't have to look at them anymore, because they can't. Right now, a lot of people are simply going unmonitored in European communities because the police does not have the capacity to look after them. So CVE, counter-radicalization, is not to replace counterterrorism. It's not an alternative to counterterrorism. It is complementary. And if you go to a lot of European countries, you will find amongst the most enthusiastic supporters of CVE disengagement precisely the police and the hardcore counter-terrorists who believe this is absolutely necessary in order for them to be able to continue to do their work. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you, Boaz, for the invitation, and all of my fellow panelists. And I want to also pay tribute to the memory of Jonathan Fine. I want to do something completely different, and what I mean by that is, number one, I'm going to be extremely brief. Number two, I'm going to talk not about what we think about terrorism, Muslims think about terrorism and countering violent extremism. And number three, I'm going to base my talk on actual data, on hard numbers gathered from public opinion surveys in a number of different, about a dozen different predominantly cities, all within the last year. Most of these surveys I've commissioned and supervised myself. A few of them have been done by the Pew Foundation, which I think is far and away the best of a number of different organizations that claim to be doing survey research in Muslim societies. So what do we learn from these data? Well, there is some good news here, and this is very important, I think, and rather counterintuitive, given all of the headlines that ISIS or Daesh has been making in the last year. The truth is that Daesh or ISIS has almost no popular support in any Muslim society where we've been able to do surveys. And that includes most major Arab countries and many other countries with significant Muslim population, Nigeria to Indonesia to Malaysia to Pakistan to Turkey and so on. Almost no popular support in single digits at most. Despite the headlines, despite the propaganda, despite the videos, despite the social media, despite the hundreds of thousands of refugees now streaming across Europe, Daesh, I'm going to say it one more time, has almost no popular support among Sunni Muslim communities for whom it claims to be acting. That's the good news. The not good news is that other terrorist organizations do have significant popular support in a number of key Muslim societies today. While support for Hezbollah and for its patron, Iran, at the popular level, according to all of these surveys, has declined dramatically in the last couple of years, so that today, in most countries, it's in the low single digits, in the teens at best, support for either Hezbollah or for Iran. Arab countries and beyond is very low today. But support for Hamas or for the Muslim Brotherhood at the popular level is significantly higher across the board. Hamas, for example, has a 33% approval rating. this year and a 72% approval rating in Jordan, right across the border from here. The Muslim Brotherhood, even though it's been outlawed and labeled a terrorist organization in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, still gets between 25 and 35% popular sympathy in all three of those countries and in other countries beyond. The Palestinians, and here I have some data that, again, for one, I'm going to try to click through if I can figure out how to make this work as quickly as I can. The Palestinians are a special case. A survey that I just did with a Palestinian colleague in the West Bank and Gaza shows that Palestinian popular support for Daesh is very, very low, but for the Muslim Brotherhood, for Hamas, for Hezbollah, even for Palestine Islamic Jihad, or for Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, is higher among Palestinians, much higher among Palestinians than it is in any other Arab society. We're talking about support for all of those terrorist groups ranging from around 50% all the way up to 71 approval rating, 7% approval rating for Palestine Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, and 75% approval rating for Palestine Islamic Jihad in Gaza. More people in Gaza like Palestine Islamic Jihad than like Hamas, their own government. And the reasons, of course, are pretty clear. Their government has made them suffer, while Palestine Islamic Jihad, more radical, more violent, more connected to Iran, still stands as a kind of fantasy model of what Gazans, many of them, 3/4 of them, see as legitimate resistance, not terrorism. So what do we learn from these numbers? I would say a few points to take away, and I'm going to conclude my extremely brief remarks here. Number one, when talking about these groups and trying to address Muslim audiences, it is much better to talk about extremism than it is to talk about terrorism, because the surveys show that Muslim audiences don't like extremists, resist labeling even the most radical groups, even the most violent ones, as quote-unquote terrorists. And it is better to talk about specific groups than to talk about terrorism or violent extremism in general. Calling Daesh an extremist organization, or Hezbollah a terrorist, or better, an extremist organization, that is a better approach to Muslim audiences than talking broadly and generically about either violent extremism or terrorism. Number two, don't be misled or overly alarmed by all the headlines about Daesh. It is not the wave of the future, even in Sunni Muslim communities, if popular sympathy is of that. And number three, and perhaps most counterintuitively of all, for Muslim audiences, we talk about countering violent extremism or countering terrorism. Both of those are negative words. What are we against? We, or better yet, Muslims themselves, need to tell their own societies what they are for, not just what they are against. And here, I take some encouragement from one statistic in the Palestinian survey that I did just a month or so ago in the West Bank and Gaza. I don't know if I can get the right slide up, but I'll tell you what the number is. 3/4 of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza say it would be a good idea to reform Islam, or to at least interpret Islam in a more moderate, tolerant, and modern way. 3/4 of Palestinians say that. That is the positive message. That is just as much an essential part of efforts that they or we might make to counter violent extremism or to counter terrorism as any negative message that any of us can convey. Thank you very much.
Actually, that's tomorrow's. There's no PowerPoint, so you're actually showing tomorrow's presentation. Thank you.
You can always close them.
I like it.
Here you are.
Thank you. In the little bit of time that I have, is certainly distinct disadvantages to having a last name at the end of the alphabet and coming between you and lunch. So my name's Errol Southers. I am going to take the time, the little time that I have, to recognize Boaz, who we affectionately call each other my brother from another mother. I'm in my second home here. I come here a lot. I want to thank ICT, Stevie, and the staff for everything you do to put this on each year. I've been here many years. I really feel comfortable here, and I want to give my condolences and support to Jonathan's family, who always treated me like a colleague. I learned a great deal from him, and he will be missed. So I'm going to take this brief time to shine a very different light, you probably will be surprised, an American perspective on CVE, but an even different perspective, an American perspective of the majority of my career in law enforcement at a number of different levels, including a 3-letter acronym agency who you all know, and a perspective now as I am engaged in a number of field research efforts dealing with communities with people who look like me. So we have this new acronym. It's been around for some time, but it's really resonating with the media and with populations in the United States. But what this really means in the United States, we're grappling with what this means is that we're trying to deal with Americans who are killing Americans. What's the definition of terrorism? And Boaz and I have gone back and forth many years over this, and with all due respect to the fact that he's been a mentor and he was on my doctoral committee, I'll have to defer to him. But we do disagree with regards to the threat of this phenomenon and the actual phenomenon taking place, when the distinction should really be between an enemy and a non-enemy. CVE and terrorism, extremism is a basic element that fuels the process of terrorism. If you do things that create fear, intimidate, inflict economic or psychological damage, and or change the political realities other than by prescribed processes, you qualify, at least as a terrorist. So a new acronym is unhelpful. They're all enemies. What's missing from the conversation and the analysis and the efforts to mitigate the threat of this dynamic is a recognition of a more holistic approach to extremism. That would include what I've defined as 3 motivational ideologies. One based on race, one based on religion, and one based on issue-oriented individuals or groups. When it comes to terrorism and terror incidents in the United States, we cling to this notion of otherism. And when we hear homegrown terrorism in the United States, we automatically hear foreign-born, newly immigrated attacker, or foreign ideology. And we derive a comfort level from this. When the Boston Marathon bombing happened 2 years ago, the Tsarnaev brothers, despite having lived the majority of their lives in Boston, were cast as some new immigrants to Boston. What's even more interesting about the Tsarnaev brothers is that Tamerlan, the older one, was not only a Muslim extremist, but also was a neo-Nazi Holocaust denier, which is often. The United States should continue to learn from its greatest ally and leverage this teachable moment. That's what's going on here in Israel right now. Israel is calling these homegrown acts of Jewish terrorism what they are: terrorism. Scalia yesterday was spot on when he said, these are not just hoodlums. This is an ideology. So it's time for at least the United States to get over its aversion for the T word. It's time to stop watering down attacks when politically motivated individuals are killing civilians. I was to see Nadal Hassan, who you all may remember from the Fort Hood shooting, prosecuted for, of all things, despite his history, workplace violence. Dylan Ruff, who walked into a South Carolina church and killed 9 parishioners who were doing nothing more than praying in their house of worship, is going to be prosecuted for hate crime. In summarizing the criteria for Ruff's charge, the Attorney General described his ideologically motivated attack as, quote, the original domestic terrorism. So why are we calling it something else? As Boaz mentioned earlier, CVE, this new acronym, if you want to call it that, is part of counterterrorism. If you're not engaging the communities, the targeted communities that are being looked at by our adversaries for recruitment and radicalization, we're missing the point. We're countering terrorism. And I'm just going to close very briefly. It's time to call a duck a duck. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suthers, for some very good points there. And thank you all for making, I think it was a fascinating panel. Ever since Peter talked about soup, I've been dying for lunch. I've been told that we had to end by 1:15 so you could all go out to lunch. So really, thank you to each one of our panelists.